Mr. President, I had since there's some time here, I will ask unanimous consent that I be acknowledged as if in morning business for whatever time I shall consume.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, there are several things that toward the end of the week here I was wanting to elaborate a little bit on. One was, and I'll take them in, they're kind of unrelated subjects, but we don't get this opportunity very often. The whole idea of Guantanamo Bay is something that I know a lot of people have talked about. I was very proud at the inauguration when our new president, President Obama, gave a lot of statements that were, I thought, very logical, and frankly, it was a speech that I could very well have made. Not as eloquent as he is, but from a content perspective. He had said in relationship to the problem at Gitmo or Guantanamo Bay that yes, we want to close that. However, we first must figure out what we're going to do with the detainees that are there, recognizing that there are about 245 detainees that were there, recognizing further that there will be more as there's an escalation in activity in Afghanistan. And there's no place else to put these people. And so I felt pretty satisfied at that time that this resource, this great American resource that we have called Guantanamo Bay, is something that we need to keep. It's one of the few good deals that government has. We've had it since 1903. And it's a resource where there's nothing else like it, not only in our holdings, but any place in the world. It's a place where we've actually built a courtroom that will handle tribunals, that'll handle cases with the rules of evidence that would fit tribunals as opposed to our court system. So I felt pretty comfortable knowing that there's nothing that can be done with the 245 detainees. Many of our very dangerous terrorists who are there. And since that time, he's changed his position. Now he's saying, well, we're going to close it regardless. He's already closed the courtroom. Well, if you close this courtroom, and I have to say that this facility, it took 12 months to build, cost $12 million, and there's nothing else quite like it. And so if you're going to ever adjudicate these individuals, if you're going to bring them to trial, you got to put them someplace, and one of the alternatives would be our court system. Well, obviously, that's not a good idea, and I think most thinking people realize it's not a good idea because the rules of evidence being different than they are in a normal criminal case, most likely you would not get convictions. And what happens when you don't get convictions? You turn people loose. And if there's anything we don't want, it's terrorists being turned loose out of a system. Well, I think the politics of that is such that people are who want to close Guantanamo Bay are still backing away from that issue, but they're still talking about closing it. The other problem I have with it is, and I've had occasion to be down there several times. In fact, the last time I was there, I used this new technology that I really didn't understand too well called the YouTube, and I did a program down there from Guantanamo Bay. And I commented at that time, here we are with about 6 levels of security for 6 levels of inmates or detainees. And there's no place else like it that we can do something like this. In terms of how they are treated, I've had them say, with a translator, it's probably the best food they've ever had in their lives. There is one medical practitioner, in most cases doctors, for each 2 detainees. I mean, where are you going to find that out? There are procedures that are offered to these detainees that they would never have had offered anywhere else. One was the offering of a colonoscopy, which once described to the detainees what it entailed. They decided they didn't want it. But nonetheless, these are things that were offered in the way of health care for these individuals. In the case of torture, there's never been a documented case of waterboarding or any severe torture that was taking place there. And I can remember the week after 9/11, when we had immediately a few people that were in there, I went down and found that our own troops that were stationed down there were not treated as well as the detainees. But even if that weren't true, there is no other place that you can put them. There has been a proposal that there are some 17 detention installations in the United States that would be suitable for these people. One of them happened to be Fort Sill, which happens to be in my state of Oklahoma. So I went to Fort Sill, And I talked to a young lady there who was a sergeant major of our detention facility at Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma, and talked to her about this. And she said, well, Senator, I have to ask you the question, why is it that everyone's so concerned about closing Guantanamo Bay? This facility here is not nearly as suitable for detainees. And then she went on to explain why, the separation of people and of classes of security problems. And she said, besides that, I spent 2 years. This is Sergeant Major Carter, stationed at Fort Sill. She said, I spent 2 years in Guantanamo Bay. I was stationed there. And that facility is better than any federal facility that we have. Why is it we are so bent just because of some ugly rumors that were not true about treatment of detainees on closing a resource that we have had, we're still paying $4,000 a year for, as we have been ever since 1903. And that's, you don't get many bargains like that in government. But anyway, they seem to be concerned about doing that. Now I believe that public pressure is going to come around on our side, and common sense will prevail, and we will not close that resource that we have. We will need it in the future. We need it today. We've needed it in the past. It's served us well. So as this moves along, I hope that the public knows there are several of us who are going to make sure that we do not do anything that is going to allow some of these detainees to be floating around in the continental United States. And if you, by the way, if you were inclined to do this program where you put them in some 17 installations, that you would have 17 magnets for terrorism in the United States. That's not going to happen. Mr. President, what I really wanted to come down and visit about with is some striking similarities between what's happening today and what happened back in 1993. I think the first 100 days of President Obama's administration will be remembered for its unprecedented level of new federal spending. No question about that. No Democrat or Republican can deny that. And the return to big government. This, together with his advocacy of the far-left liberal causes, everything from abortion rights to gun control to universal health care, will put him on a track to repeat the performance of 1993, when a very attractive young Bill Clinton entered the Oval Office under the banner of change, after Americans realized that his so-called change was simply an extremely left-wing position. The American people revolted and put Republicans back in charge of Congress. If President Obama continues down this path, I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen again in 2010. Nothing is more indicative of the stark contrast between conservatives and liberals than a massive government spending spree now underway in Washington. In his first year in office, Bill Clinton put forward what was then the largest budget to date ever in our history. It was $1.5 trillion, a $1.5 trillion budget that included domestic spending of some $123 billion. Now, in this 100th day of President Obama's administration, the Senate is poised to vote on what would become the largest budget to date. This budget, which highlights his priorities, is the most radical and partisan budget that we've ever seen. It includes $4.4 trillion in additional deficits and $3.5 trillion in total spending. Now, let's compare that to 1993. I was down on the floor complaining about a $1.5 trillion budget, and this is a $3.5 trillion budget. And I go back to Oklahoma. Sometimes I come to the conclusion that there aren't any real normal people in Washington, because they ask the question, they say, well, Senator, how can we afford all this spending? When we have a stimulus bill of $789 billion, we have increasing the debt by $1.8 trillion in the first year in a $3.5 trillion budget. Where's the money going to come from? And here I am, the senior United States Senator from Oklahoma. I can't answer that question, because you have some choices. You can borrow it, you can print it. It's going to have to be a combination of the above, but we know all of these have very damaging effects. $1 trillion in taxes on individuals and businesses, a $634 billion down payment for government-run health insurance. There it goes again, another similarity. You remember 1993, it was called Hillary Healthcare then. The concept was that government can run a healthcare system better than people can. And consequently, I always invite people who really believe that to go up and spend some time in some of the hospitals up north, Mayo's Clinic and some of the others come to mind, and see the number of people who are there who came over from Canada because they couldn't get a treatment. Maybe their age was right above the federal guideline for a particular type of procedure, and they could no longer do it. So again, the similarities are so similar in 1993 and what's happening today. So then, of course, we had the Wall Street bailout and all that. But I'm very concerned about the direction that this administration has proposed to take us. Anyone who works hard, plays by the rules, pays taxes, drives a car, turns on the lights, saves, invests, donates to charity, or plans to be successful in this country should also be concerned. Defense cuts. I probably am more concerned about this than most of the members are. I am the second ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I've watched what's going on right now, and it's just, to me, it's just deplorable. I happened to be, by coincidence, in Afghanistan when Secretary Gates came out with Obama's defense cuts. And they try to claim they are not defense cuts. They are. It's just that they're talking about the DOD appropriations bill versus all the other funding sources that have been used before. Now, the best evidence that they're cuts are what's happened to our platforms. Right now, the F-22 is the only platform that we have that is fifth generation maturity. And this is something that he's axing. He's stopping it right now. We were originally supposed to have 750 F-22s. Now we're going to stop at 187. At the same time, you have China with their J-12. You have Russia with their SU series of fifth-generation airplanes, and that's going to put us in a position where it's going to hurt, and hurt bad. Same thing is true with Future Combat System. The Future Combat System that we've been working on for 8 years now, since Shinseki helped us start it, and we were there with him, or at least I was, is the first transition in ground capability in at least 50 years. And this is something we've been working on so that we don't send our kids into battle with against countries that might have a better artillery piece than we have and better equipment than we have. And he axed that program. Missile defense. You know, how long has it been since we started working with the parliaments of Poland and the parliaments of the Czech Republic to get them to let us put a radar system in the Czech Republic and then an interceptor capability in Poland so that not if, but when Iran gets a capability and the sending capability of sending a nuke over to Western Europe or Eastern United States, we'd have ability to shoot it down. Didn't happen. The parliaments who had to be politically pretty strong to agree to do that, now they're sitting back and finding out that they're talking about axing that program too. I mean, the airborne laser is the closest thing we have to knocking down a missile in the boost phase, and that we were coming along with that program. They axed that program too. So I'm very much concerned about what happens and what has happened in this budget to our capability of defending ourselves. And then I go back to 1993, that's exactly what happened back then. If you look at the 8 years of the Clinton administration, we cut military spending from what would be just a straight line by $412 billion in that period of time. And of course, we ended up cutting our military by about 40% over that period of time. But anyway, the bottom line is all these programs were cut, and I happened to be in Afghanistan when that happened, and we did a report from over there, and you could see the Bradleys driving by and the helicopters taking off, the bad weather, our soldiers coming in from patrols, and at that time turning on the tube and finding out that President Obama is going to gut the military. It's totally unacceptable. But that's the same thing that happened in 1993, deja vu all over again. Gun control, same thing. We see now that they're going to try to get us to sign onto a treaty. It's called CIFTA, C-I-F-T-A. I can't remember what it stands for. But it's a program, it's a treaty in the Western Hemisphere that will all get together and will allow the Central America and Mexico and South America and Canada to determine what our gun manufacturers can do. It's the first major step to gun control in violation of the Second Amendment rights. Well, people care about that. Exactly what happened with Bill Clinton in 1993. Energy taxes, back when Bill Clinton was doing it, it was called the BTU tax. That stands for British Thermal Units. It was one that was a massive tax increase on energy, and very similar to what they're trying to do right now, which incidentally, I have no doubt in my mind we will stop them from being able to do the cap and trade tax. One thing about the cap and trade tax, that's something that is not just a one-shot deal like the stimulus bill. That's every year. And it would be somewhere around $350 billion a year, taxes on the American people, a regressive tax, because it's a tax on energy, and people who with lower income spend a larger percentage of their expendable income on energy, that kind of energy, than rich people do. And we're not going to let that happen. I can just tell all my friends that we've been fighting that battle now for 8 years, and it's over. We're not going to let that happen in America. But that's what Bill Clinton tried to do in 1993, the same thing all over again. So we have went through the same thing on abortion. I think personally that there's no mission more important than standing up for the sanctity of human life. And here again, President Obama, like President Clinton, quickly moved to appease pro-abortion advocates. Just a few days ago, the Senate confirmed that Kathleen Sebelius for Secretary of Health and Human Services. As governor of Kansas since 2002, she has a clear record of supporting abortion and policies that I believe impact health and safety of women and parental rights. Again, it's abortion. Either you're for it or against it, but this is one of the strong positions, pro-abortion positions in 1993, that now we're getting again out of this administration. So when you look at this, I can't help but think that all the signs are there, that we're seeing the same thing now that we saw back in 1993, and that I believe we're going to be positioned to keep a lot of these things from happening, number one. And number two, let's remember what happened. In 1993, young, attractive Bill Clinton went in as President of the United States. And he had the House, and he had the Senate. He had it all, just like President Obama has it all. He has the House and the Senate. Therefore, it's not someone else's fault for all these programs. And consequently, we had a major turnover in the 1994 election. Republicans took over the House and the Senate. So I just warn my liberal friends from the other side of the aisle, be real careful, watch what you're doing, because this could very well happen again. Now, I do have something that is not, it's a little heavier lifting subject, but it's one. I am the ranking member of the Environment Public Works Committee. I used to, when the Republicans were a majority, I was the chairman of it. And something's happening right now, and something happened Tuesday morning that I want to make sure everybody understands as this week is coming to an end. On April 17th, the administration set in motion a ticking time bomb with its release of a proposed endangerment finding for carbon dioxide and 5 other greenhouse gases. This proposal finds, and now this incidentally is what all the scientists don't agree with, but this proposal finds that carbon dioxide is a dangerous pollutant that threatens the public health and welfare, and therefore must be regulated under the Clean Air Act. Now, this is interesting because they first tried to pass a cap and trade. They know that there are not the votes for it. There are in the House. Speaker Pelosi pretty much gets anything through that she wants, and it's a simple majority over there. Over here, it would take 60 votes to pass that massive tax increase. And we're not going to do it because they don't have more than 34, maybe 35 votes, and it takes 60 votes. But nonetheless, since they can't do it, they decided to do it under the Clean Air Act and do it through regulation, so it can be done from the White House. Now, this so-called endangerment finding sets a clock ticking on a vast array of regulations and taxes with little or no political debate or congressional control. On May 12th, we learned of a White House document. This is significant. We didn't know it was there, and I want to credit our committee, the Environment Public Works Committee, the minority side, for finding this document. It's a White House document marked privileged and confidential, buried deep within the docket of the proposed rule. It outlines some of the very same concerns shared by me and many of my colleagues, including Senator Barrasso. I couldn't be here for that Tuesday morning meeting, and he was good enough to take this memo and expose it and did an excellent job of it. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about their proposal for new taxes, new regulations, all these things that they want to go through with because they can't pass legislatively a cap and trade or cap and tax, as some call it, proposal. The document that we found allegedly a compilation of concerns from unnamed officials within the White House or the administration as part of an interagency review of the proposed regulation, raises some questions, very serious criticisms of the endangerment proposal. Chief among them are questions raised about the link between the EPA's scientific argument for endangerment and its political summary. And I'm going to just quote from it. I've got 3 quotes on it. This, keep in mind, this came from the administration. This report says, and I'm quoting now, the finding rests heavily on the precautionary principle, but the amount of acknowledged lack of understanding about basic facts surrounding the greenhouse gases seems to stretch the precautionary principle to providing for regulation in the face of unprecedented uncertainty. In other words, what they're saying there is the science is not there. We don't know yet. We know there are a lot of problems with this, and we shouldn't be rushing into it. This came from the White House. I'm glad we found it. Here's a further quote. Additionally, it says, there is a concern that EPA is making a finding based on harm from substances that have no demonstrated direct health effects, such as respiratory or toxic effects, and that available scientific data that purports to conclusively establish the nature and the extent of the adverse public health and welfare effects are almost exclusively from non-EPA sources. Again, this is not me talking. This is a quote from the White House in a buried document that we fortunately, but surprisingly, did find. Now you can ask, what source is the EPA relying on if it's going to go through all this thing? That source is the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is where it all started. It was the United Nations that started this whole issue of greenhouse gases, of CO2, anthropogenic gases, methane causing global warming. And when you look at their 4th assessment report, which I've documented in speeches before on the Senate floor many times, it is a political, not a science-based body. It has no accountability here in the United States. You keep hearing people say, what about the NAS, the National Academy of Scientists? What about them? Are they, they're scientists. No, the reports they give are not from the NAS. They're from the political review or the summary for policymakers, the summary for policymakers, which is a political document, not another document. Now, in addition to the White House memo, also warns of a cascade of unintended regulatory consequences if the endangerment finding is finalized. It states again, and I'm quoting again from this report, making the decision to regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act. That's what they want to do, is regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act for the first time is likely to have serious economic consequences for regulated entities throughout the United States economy, including small business and small communities. This report talks about the small businesses, small communities, churches, other groups that are going to be adversely affected by this. Again, this is a document that came out of the White House. Now, for one thing, I'm glad to know that we are not alone with our concerns and that several in the Obama administration share the views similar to ours on the endangerment finding. And I'm hopeful more will come forward. So what was the administration's official response to the release of this memo? Well, it depended on who you ask. One source in the Obama administration chose to again blame it on the Bush administration, stating that it was written by a holdover appointed by George W. Bush. However, earlier in the day, Peter Orszag, who heads the White House budget office, where the memo apparently came from, stated that the quotations circulated in the press are from a document in which the OMB simply collated and collected disparate comments from various agencies during the interagency review process of the proposed finding. These collected comments were not necessarily internally consistent since they came from multiple sources and they do not necessarily represent the views of OMB or the administration. Well, this is fine to say this, but that's where it came from. It came from the administration, and it's very fortunate that we found it. Now, it begs the question then, does this document reflect one rogue leftover Bush appointee or who, based on follow-up news reports, actually appears to be a Democrat, or do they reflect a more systematic summary of comments from various agencies who have serious concerns with the proposed findings, as Orszag suggested? I'm hoping that someone from the administration will come forth with a consistent response. In either case, I welcome the comments as an open and honest discussion of the potential costs and benefits and legal justifications for such a finding. Regardless of the Supreme Court decision, the EPA has the discretion to carefully weigh the science and the causes and effects in its determination of endangerment. And despite recent claims by the administration officials, it's under no court order to find in the affirmative that such greenhouse gases endanger public health or welfare or cause or contribute to air pollution. And if we're going to have a debate on this issue, let's have it here in Congress, where the American people deserve an open and honest discussion about the costs and alleged benefits, about the effectiveness of such policies and what it will mean to the consumers who ultimately pay the bill. As I said before, it's going to be the poorer Americans who pay the larger percentage of their incomes that are going to be punished. And by the way, we've had this debate here. In the House, they've never had the debate because it's never come up as an issue. Here we had the debate back during the ratification debate of the Kyoto Treaty. Then we had the McCain-Lieberman bill, the Warner-Lieberman bill, the Boxer, there's another bill that came up just in the last year. So we've had the debate, a full and open debate. And we are going to have to debate on this, because this is an effort to try to do through regulation what they can't do through open debate and the process on the floor. The administration, and this EPA in particular, have claimed they will usher in a new era of transparency. In April, Administrator Jackson issued a sweeping memo to all EPA employees committing the agency to an unprecedented level of transparency, and I applaud her for it. She told me this in my office, and we also found that she made this statement in a private memo to members. So she's being very honest in what her effort is. I have a feeling that a lot of this stuff is happening, and she's not even aware of it. But she says, and this is a quote, this is beautiful, "The success of our environmental efforts depends on earning and maintaining the trust of the public we serve. See, that the American people will not trust us to protect their health and their environment if they do not trust us to be transparent and inclusive in our decision making. To earn this trust, we must conduct business with the public openly and fairly." Now, this is Lisa Jackson, the new administrator of the EPA, and I applaud her for saying this. This requires not only that the EPA remain open and accessible to those representing all points of view, but also that the EPA officers responsible for the decisions take affirmative steps to solicit the views of those who will be affected by these decisions. That's a quote. She went on to say in her confirmation hearing, not only did she reaffirm this statement, but she said that she would be responsive to us on the minority side the same as she would be to the majority. And I believe that. Now, certainly the allegations in this White House memo make one question whether the EPA is open and accessible to all points of view. For one thing, it was marked privileged and confidential, which tells me that perhaps they knew about it, but then they didn't want to use it, and they didn't want people to find out about it. But nonetheless, the document speaks for itself. My colleagues may criticize the Bush administration for how it handled the endangerment finding, but at least they didn't try to bury it or hide these types of comments when it proposed its advance notice of proposed rulemaking last summer. I know that a lot of this sounds a little confusing. This is a process that you go through an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. In fact, the previous administration, that's the Bush administration, went so far as to lay all of these comments out in a public view so all sides could be represented. If this latest action is any indication of how the EPA has begun to operate, then the American public should have serious reason to be concerned. On the CO2 endangerment issue, potentially the largest, most sweeping EPA regulatory effort ever to be proposed, transparency should be a cornerstone of every agency action, and opinions from all sides, pro and con, and certainly from all other agencies, should be weighed equally and fairly, and just as importantly, openly, in full view of the American people. The American people deserve to know all sides, all costs, and all benefits. And this thing is so costly, and with the questionable benefits, this is that much more important. Now, because of these issues, I'm hopeful that the administrator will commit to a determination on endangerment that would be based on the record of scientific data and empirical evidence rather than political or non-scientific considerations. It is of our utmost importance that the regulatory matters of this scope and magnitude are based on the most objective, balanced, scientific, and empirical data. And while I'm still hopeful that ultimately Congress or the agency will decide to take this option off the table, a full on-the-record examination during any endangerment rulemaking should be a minimum requirement of transparency. But the administration essentially politicized the issue by presenting policymakers with false choice. The choice was use an outdated, ill-equipped, and economically disastrous option under the Clean Air Act, or pick another bad option, a cap and trade that commits us to the requirements for unaffordable and certainly the largest consistent annual tax increase in the history of America. And this isn't going to happen. I would say, repeat, that we are fortunate in that we have had this debate. And each time we have the debate, there are more and more people come down and say, well, I didn't know it was going to cost that much money. And while back in the original Kyoto days, it appeared that about a majority of the people in the United States Senate would support that type of an approach. But then later on, and by the way, I have to say this, the Kyoto Treaty is one thing. That's a treaty that affects the whole world, and a lot of kind of developed nations and some undeveloped nations. And it was something that if you sign on and everybody signs on, it's something that everyone agrees to. Now, since that didn't happen, and even if you're one of these individuals who believes that anthropogenic gases, CO2, methane, are causing global warming, if you really believed it, which isn't true, but if you did believe it, then does it make sense for us to pass something unilaterally here in the United States, making us less competitive than the rest of the world? I mean, what's going to happen to our manufacturing base? What's left of it is going to end up in places like China, India, Mexico, where they don't have to have these emission requirements. What's going to happen then? It's going to be a net increase in CO2. So back to the memo, and I will conclude with this. I've got to repeat what the memo says, and this is a memo that was advice to the process from the White House. The finding rests heavily on the precautionary principle, but the amount of acknowledged lack of understanding about basic facts surrounding greenhouse gases, which seem to stretch the precautionary principle to providing for regulation in the face of unprecedented uncertainty. In other words, it is uncertain. And further, it states, there is a concern that EPA is making a finding based on harm from substances that have no demonstrated direct health effects, such as respiratory or toxic effects, and the available scientific data that purports to conclusively establish the nature and extent of the adverse public health and welfare effects are almost exclusively from non-EPA sources. That's an admission. And finally, making the decision, which I think hopefully will not make the decision to do it, but we will oppose that decision, making the decision, quoting from the report, to regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act for the first time is likely to have serious economic consequences for regulated entities throughout the United States economy, including small businesses and small communities. In other words, nobody wins. Nobody wins. So with that, I would say that there is this effort that what they could not do legislatively, they want to do through regulations, and we're inclined not to allow that to happen.